It's almost mid-June, but let's take a look at the playoff picture and where the Royals stack up in this edition of Locked On Royals.
You are Locked On Royals, your daily Kansas City Royals podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
You are tuned into another edition of Locked On Royals on the Locked On Podcast Network. As always, I'm your host, Jack Johnson, and you can find me on Twitter or X at JohnnyJ_15. That's at JOHNYJ_15. You also can find us on wherever you get your podcasts. That can be Spotify, Apple Podcast, Amazon Music, Google Podcast. We're on Odyssey, and we're on YouTube. Just be sure to hit that follow button and subscribe. If you are a first-time listener and you want to know a little bit more about me, well, I am based here in Kansas City. I work at Sports Radio 810 WHB. I do some hosting, co-hosting, and some producing as well. So stay pretty busy in the sports world, one could say. But also, along with those work responsibilities, we bring you this podcast 5 days a week. Not always at the same time, but almost every single week, we're going to give you 5 episodes a week, unless it is the off season when it drops down to 3 episodes a week. But for today's episode, wanted to let you know that it is brought to you by PrizePicks. You're going to have the NBA Finals Game 3 coming up. We've got, of course, baseball in full swing. So head over to PrizePicks and start picking your players that you think are going to bring home the most money. We'll have more on them coming up in about 10 to 15 minutes or so. Well, as I mentioned to begin the show, we're only in mid-June, so going over some playoff predictions, which teams are going to be there, it feels a little bit foolish, but it's also the first time in a long time we could have a realistic conversation, one that made sense, involving playoff baseball and the Kansas City Royals. So even though there's 90-plus games to go in the regular season, we're over 40% through the 2024 campaign. So it's not nothing. There is a pretty large sample size going around in Major League Baseball. If you are a bad baseball team, you likely know that you're a bad baseball team right now. If you are an elite team, you likely know you're elite. And for the Royals, they kind of find themselves closer to the elite category than they do to the bad category, though some people out there that want to remain pessimistic might believe the opposite. But I'm only here to give you what the standings are showing right now on the American League side. Again, I would give the National League side, but I know for a lot of you listening, you really care about what the American League side is showing right now. Well, the update going into tonight's game, the number 1 seed in the American League would be the New York Yankees, and that's not going to change likely unless injuries get in the way. I mean, the Royals are playing the Yankees right now. They just seem like a buzzsaw. And I thought that Baltimore was going to be a bigger buzzsaw, if you will. That might be the best phrase I can come up with. But New York just seems borderline unstoppable. They're 47-21, the number 1 seed on the American League side. The second seed is the Cleveland Guardians. They're 42-22, 20 games over. And, of course, leading the American League Central, the 3 seed, who the Royals just saw in Kansas City, Seattle Mariners. They are 38-30. They had a big-time walk-off win against the White Sox last night, a walk-off grand slam by Cal Raleigh. But those are the 3 division leaders in the American League side. Then you get to the wild card. Baltimore holds the top wild card spot. They lead Kansas City by 5 games for that number 1 spot. They're 43-22, a better record than the Cleveland Guardians. Then you have Kansas City at 39-28, holding on to the second wild card spot, 3.5 games up on Minnesota, who holds the final wild card spot at 35-31. Boston and Detroit are the ones that are chasing Minnesota right now and chasing Kansas City. The Royals hold a 5.5 game cushion over Boston, a 6 game cushion over Detroit for a playoff spot. So that part of it you feel pretty good about. But a part of the reason I wanted to do the playoff picture is I think it's totally fine now in mid-June to start going over hypotheticals, to start scoreboard watching. As I mentioned in the first 2 minutes today, it can be seen as foolish to bring up playoffs on June 11th. but we can talk about it. It's not like it's the second week of April where you're going to have teams that are overachieving because of a soft schedule. We know a lot about every single team and the playoff picture right now. But I thought this was interesting. And at the end of the day, I really don't care who the Royals play because I'm not expecting them to be a World Series contender. I think you roll the dice in October and you get a playoff series, you've already overachieved to the max. Some people want to set the bar higher. Where I'm at, if they can just get into the postseason, that is one hell of a season in Kansas City. But I thought this was interesting because every time the calendar turns, MLB puts out a post of if the season ended today, here are the playoff matchups. And for the last 2 months, it has been Kansas City and Baltimore, meeting at Camden Yards for the first round of the wild card series. And then it's flip-flop back and forth where the winner of that series will take on the Yankees or they will take on the Cleveland Guardians. Those two feel like the top two seeds in the American League. The only change I could see is, of course, either the Royals winning the Central or the Orioles winning the American League East. Here is the fun part about it, though, is that when you are in a spot like this and the Royals are comfortably in a playoff spot, it does not mean they're going to be there forever, but they are comfortably in a playoff spot. And even though Minnesota is that team that I think strikes a little bit of fear in me of catching fire, we saw the Royals and Twins play a couple weeks ago. It is a group that can really be dangerous if they can start winning 7, 8, 9 in a row, as they've done before this season. But I look at Boston, I look at Detroit, I look at Toronto, I look at Tampa, and I look at Texas. Those all seem like the big-time threats from stealing a playoff spot. And none of them really move the needle for me. Boston split with the White Sox this past weekend. Their 500 always seem to hover around 500. Detroit, the Royals already swept. Toronto, the Royals took a series from both in Kansas City and in Toronto. Texas did take the series from Kansas City, and they're going to meet next weekend. We'll be down there for that series in Arlington for Friday and Saturday's game, but they're incredibly banged up. Tampa Bay, they're 4 games under 500. So you look at those teams that are chasing Kansas City, they don't really strike too much fear, at least to me. Maybe they do for you. Maybe you're far more concerned about the Royals bottoming out than one of those teams catching fire, and I totally get that. But I look at the matchups and what it could possibly mean. As I said before, I really don't care who they play. If they just got in, I don't care if it's the Yankees. I don't care if it's the Orioles, because those two feel like the likeliest matchups, unless they finish with the last wild card spot. And sometimes I get the seedings mixed up and who actually plays who, but I think it's the first two get a bye. So Cleveland and New York right now would get byes. Seattle would have to play the last wild card team, and then the second wild card team has to go on the road to the first wild card team. So the Twins would get to go to Seattle, whereas the Royals would have to go take on the Orioles. You look at who's the tougher matchup, I would argue that the Royals would much rather take on Seattle. But again, playoffs is the playoffs. You're going to have to beat good teams. And for the Royals, why not go play spoiler against one of the favorites on the American League side? But that's kind of the fun part about this right now, is you can start thinking about who you'd rather see in the playoffs, because the Royals aren't just scrapping for a spot. They are comfortably in a playoff spot right now, at least on June 11th. They are comfortably in a playoff spot. And that, to me, is the most reassuring thing. That even in this awful week where they have to play the Yankees and the Dodgers, they would not only have to play poorly, they'd have to have those teams play pretty well for that gap to close a little bit. And when I think about it, I think that the Royals have a much better chance at this point in time, remaining steady, having enough firepower to get to the end in September with a playoff spot than Boston does, than Tampa does, than Toronto does, than Texas does, than Detroit does. Those teams, I just don't know if are consistent enough and haven't shown that level of consistency. Minnesota may catch the Royals. They've got playoff pedigree. This Royals team does not. But even if they did, you get into the playoffs and might have an easier path to the ALDS. And instead of getting the Orioles, you'd get Seattle. still wouldn't be favored to win that series. But that's the fun part about this right now. A playoff picture, no matter when you look at it, it's fun to fantasize about it a little bit. And right now, I think a lot of Royals fans are looking at that and thinking, okay, where do we need to scoreboard watch? Where does it make sense? Who should we be worried about? I'm not really worried about any of the teams on the outside looking in. They can always make me change my mind about it, especially if the Royals start playing bad baseball. But it's a pretty firm 6 right now in the playoff picture. And it has not moved around a lot. It hasn't moved around in a while. The Orioles, Royals, and Twins have held a playoff spot for a long period of time. And how about that? Half of the American League playoff teams are from the AL Central. That would show you how impressive it's been this year for what the Royals are doing, being able to make the playoffs in a year their division has been so tough. Okay, we're going to take our first break of the show. When we come back, the Royals had to make 2 roster moves. How do we think those players are going to fare in Kansas City for as ever long as they are up here? We'll dive into that next on Locked On Royals. You are tuned into Locked On Royals on the Locked On Podcast Network. As always, I'm your host, Jack Johnson, and you can find me on Twitter or X at JohnnyJ_15. That's at JOHNYJ_15. Before we dive into our next segment, want to give a shout out to a couple of the sponsors today, starting with Ibotta. Now, with Ibotta, spring has sprung, and that means spring cleaning, whether that means stocking up on cleaning supplies or swapping out your winter clothes for new spring clothes. Make sure you're using Ibotta and get real cash back with every purchase. Now, this spring, flowers won't be the only thing you're growing. When you use Ibotta, you can watch your cashback grow with every purchase you make. And Ibotta is a free app that gives you the most cash back every time you shop on hundreds of items, from groceries to beauty supplies to toys, so you can make sure you're beating inflation no matter what you're purchasing. The average Ibotta user earns $256 per year, and that can cover the cost of an entire shopping trip, that flight you've been eyeing, or the fancy dinner that you've been craving. Right now, Ibotta is offering our listeners $5 for just trying Ibotta by using code LOCKEDONMLB for when you register. Just go to the App Store or the Google Play Store and download the free Ibotta app to start earning cash back and use code LOCKEDONMLB. That's IBOTTA in the Google Play or the App Store and use code LOCKEDONMLB. Also want to let you know about PrizePicks, and with PrizePicks, you could turn $10 into $1,000 in a single game watching your favorite sports this summer. You can make a PrizePicks lineup in as little as 60 seconds, and you just need to pick more or less on 2 to 6 player stat projections when you're locked in. If you're looking for promotions, PrizePicks has you covered every week, from lowering select players' stat projections on Tuesdays, which increases your chances of getting a win, to getting your entry fees back if you're having a losing lineup on Friday. And this is only optional for June, but there's always action on PrizePicks, and this is the perfect time to try out something new as basketball is winding down. Game 3 of the finals here in a couple of days, but make sure to try out esports this month, because every Wednesday and Saturday in June, if your lineup doesn't win, you'll get an entry fee back. Choose from Counter-Strike 2, Call of Duty, League of Legends, and more. Download the app today and use code LOCKEDONMLB for a first deposit match of up to $100. That's Locked On MLB, LOCKEDONMLB, for a first deposit match of up to $100. The Royals did have to make a roster move, or 2, I should say, earlier this afternoon. I was thinking about doing an episode before I had thought about a little bit of when that roster move would happen. We were very aware that something was going to be occurring, and I thought, well, I could do this episode at 11 o'clock, risk talking about, the outfielders and what they could do. Drew Waters on his way, Nick Pratto on his way, or I could just wait until the move was official. That way I could talk about it and not have to put this little asterisk by it and saying, well, things could always change by the time you watch this episode. There's probably a roster move that's already been made. I didn't want to do that. I just wanted to get the information and bring it to you in a second segment today. So that's exactly what we're going to do. But man, I can now exhale a little bit, knowing that I won't get any more Drew Waters questions on a Mailbag Friday. That's more so poking fun than anything. But I didn't blame a lot of the fans that were wondering where Drew Waters was. It just didn't feel like there was a fit until somebody got hurt, and that's exactly what happened last night when Hunter Renfroe fouled a couple of pitches off his foot and fractured his big toe. Now, Adam Frazier, different story. You hope all is well with him and his family. He was placed on the bereavement list. Wouldn't expect him back probably for a couple of games or so. Maybe next week is when you expect him back. Again, he just needs to focus on being with family right now. But Nick Pratto is the man they called up to take his spot off the bench. So Drew Waters and Nick Pratto are going to have an opportunity to prove to the Royals why they should stay. Pratto isn't really going to have that opportunity, even if he comes and hits a ton over the games that he plays in. Drew Waters is a different story. These next 4 to 6 weeks, really until the All-Star break, because I'd envision Hunter Renfroe is going to be ready to go by the All-Star break or right before it, and I wouldn't force it. I'd just say, all right, let's just start it fresh for the second half right after everybody's done in Arlington for All-Star week. Drew Waters has this chance now to show what the Royals lineup has been missing, especially in the outfield. But now he's got a little bit of the added pressure of Hunter Renfroe was playing well. He needs to go up and hit maybe not as well as Hunter Renfroe, but certainly hit better than MJ Melendez and try to get out there every single game. Thought it was a big nod to him that he's getting called up and he's starting in right field tonight. And they could have mixed and matched the outfield by starting MJ and Isbell and Velasquez out there in the outfield. Maybe started Fermin again and Salvi was going to DH, and they wouldn't need to worry about Drew Waters getting the start tonight. But he is going to be getting a start in a very important game of this series, a pivotal game in this series, because tomorrow night it's an opener and Daniel Lynch that's going to be facing one of the more prolific offenses in all of Major League Baseball. So it's exciting. The Royals haven't had a ton of new blood in the clubhouse in quite some time, and Drew Waters was somebody everybody's been eyeballing going back to April when Kyle Isbell and MJ Melendez and Renfroe were all struggling at the exact same time. So this is the chance now. This is what everybody in the comment section has been waiting for. Where's Drew Waters? When is he going to get his chance? When can we demote MJ for Drew Waters? Well, it didn't happen in the way that a lot of people wanted it to, because an injury had to happen to create space on the roster, but it happens in Major League Baseball. And I don't know if I see Drew Waters coming up and taking that spot from Hunter Renfroe, because I think when he's back, when he's healthy, he's going to be the right fielder. But this becomes interesting because if Drew Waters hits and hits well, then it becomes a different conversation. If Kyle Isbell isn't hitting well and Drew Waters plays good defense and he's hitting a ton, well, maybe you have your new center fielder going into the second half of the season, and then Kyle Isbell becomes your fourth outfielder. Or maybe he takes a spot from MJ Melendez because we know how much MJ has struggled. I mean, to me, this is the biggest 4 to 6 weeks in Drew Waters' baseball career. Really, I think it is that strongly worded, at least on my end. These are pivotal at-bats, games, moments for him. And if he comes up, and it's unfair to put pressure on a player like that, but if he comes up and he's flailing around, he's striking out 35% of the time, he's hitting 180, he's not going to get a chance in the second half. Because when Renfroe gets healthy, they're just going to go exactly back to where they were at. But if he forces the Royals' hand, that's when this becomes interesting. That's when you can look at Drew Waters and go, that might be our new center fielder on a playoff team. There's more of an upside. There's more of a ceiling. And I think you can look at Drew Waters and see a higher ceiling than Kyle Isbell. But as I've said multiple times on the show before, it's all about showing that it's real and not just saying that it's real. So big spot for Drew Waters tonight, hoping that he can really take this opportunity and run with it. Well, before our final segment, I want to let you know about Locked On Sports Today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel program for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you canvas analysis, opinions, and news streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Well, when we come back, we are going to talk about this softer schedule that's coming up and how important it is for the Royals to capitalize. That's next on Locked On Royals. You are tuned into Locked On Royals on the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, Jack Johnson. You can find me on Twitter or X at JohnnyJ_15. It's at JOHNYJ_15. And find us on wherever you get your podcasts. That can be Spotify, Apple Podcast, Amazon Music, Google Podcast, Odyssey, and we're on YouTube. Just be sure to hit that follow button and subscribe. Before our final segment, I want to let you know about a couple of our sponsors, a few more sponsors for today's show. And we're going to kick it off with FanDuel. Summertime means baseball and the NBA Finals and more, and you can bet it all on FanDuel. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $200 you can use to bet on everything from the Finals MVP to who's going to hit one out of the park. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and add a big win to your summer bucket list. FanDuel, America's #1 sports book. And if you are into futures bets, as I am, you can already look ahead to the NBA Finals, or maybe you want to put some money down on some awards for Major League Baseball. Right now, Matt Quatraro is the betting favorite to be the manager of the year, at least on the American League side. We talked about that in yesterday's episode. Maybe Bobby Witt Jr., the MVP favorite, but go do that over at FanDuel. They've got great deals for you, and you can start winning some big-time money. Just go and create your account after this episode today, and again, win some money at FanDuel. We also want to talk about one of our local sponsors here in PXG Golf. They really helped me out with my swing because they get you fitted for a driver if you want to do the long game, the short game. It's a great setup in there. It's so clean. It's so professional. The pros that you work with in there, it's just an awesome experience. And we've got a great deal coming up for you because PXG made me a believer. They'll do the same for every golfer in Kansas City. Visit pxg.com/lockedonroyals to schedule your fitting at PXG Kansas City, 7517 West 119th Street in Overland Park. And you get fitted for any club and you'll get a dozen golf balls free. That's pxg.com/lockedonroyals to schedule your fitting. pxg.com/lockedonroyals. And the limit is 1 dozen golf balls per person. And this promotion ends June 30th. The other terms and conditions may apply, and you can see their store for details. Well, you can look after this week and see a little bit of the sunshine, the sun rays peeking through the dark clouds of the gauntlet that the Royals had been on. And that 19-game, brutal, murderous stretch they've been on, it all comes to an end on Sunday. And the reward for playing 4 first-place teams in a row, playing the Yankees and Dodgers back-to-back. I don't know who was in charge of the scheduling out there, but they certainly wanted to test the Royals in June. That was a very clear picture for everybody that was a consumer of baseball. But kind of tying it into our first segment today with the playoff picture, I go back to the end of May, and I said June is going to dictate this season for this ball club. And if they can get through June and they still have a winning record and they're 5 to 10 games over 500, I think they are going to be playing in the playoffs come October. A part of, though, making sure you survive June is not easing up after that series finale in LA against the Dodgers. Because whereas these last couple weeks we can chalk up losses as, man, they're in a tough stretch right now. It's no wonder they're playing, a little bit lesser baseball, sub 500 baseball, because they're playing really good teams. And really good teams are going to expose your flaws. But after that series finale in LA, they're going to get the Oakland Athletics, sub 500. They're going to get the Texas Rangers on the road. As I said in this episode, that is a series that we will be down in person for. They'll then come back home to take on the Miami Marlins, sub 500. Then they'll take on the Cleveland Guardians for the second time this month. And get this, until the All-Star break, that will be the only winning team the Royals play unless the Rangers catch fire, they get above 500, and the Cardinals catch fire, and they get above 500. But the Cardinals are also a game from last place. So the stat that I had figured out, did some digging, did some research, crunching of the old numbers, if you will, of their next 24 games after they finish up in LA. So right now they have 3 against the Yankees, 3 against Dodgers. So 6 more games to go, 30 games till the All-Star break. But after that finale on Sunday, they'll have 24 games until the All-Star break. 20 of those games will come against losing teams. The only series they will have against a team with a winning record is, of course, the Cleveland Guardians. That series is at home. They have 8 series in those 24 games. Half of them are against last place teams right now, and that can still change. As I just mentioned, the Cardinals could be in last place by the time we get to that point. Last place in the National League Central. They seem to all be interchanging between second and last place in that division. It's a very weird division. But you could have 5 of your 8 series before the All-Star break against last place teams, not just losing teams, last place teams. And that's that moment of the season that if you survive these next 6 games, and the worst the Royals can be when they walk away is 5 games over 500. So they'll still be having a good record. You won't be too thrilled with how you finished up the brutal stretch of play, but that's the worst they can be. And then they've got this 24-game stretch where you look at it and go, man, what if they go, 16-8? And that feels very doable for a stretch like that. 16-8. That catapults you back. Even if they lost the rest of the games of this week, that puts you back at 13 games over 500. Just going 16-8 against some bad baseball teams. Maybe you grab a couple. You grab the series against Cleveland. You've shrunk that gap a little bit in the American League Central, though I do understand if the Royals lost 6 straight games to close out the week or 7 straight games, actually it'd be 8 in a row, that would make the AL Central race quite wide, I guess I would say. Cleveland would have a very comfortable lead. But I would probably say, knocking on wood, they're not going to play that poor of baseball all week long because the Royals haven't been swept this year and they've never lost more than 3 games in a row this year. So maybe they can grab one tonight against the Yankees, make everybody feel a lot better. But that soft part of the schedule is coming up and maybe the perfect time for the Kansas City Royals. Well, that's going to do it for another edition of Locked On Royals and the Locked On Podcast Network. I've been your host, Jack Johnson. You can always find me on Twitter or X at JohnnyJ_15. One last shout out to Locked On Sports Today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel program for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't miss analysis, opinions, and news streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Tomorrow, we're probably going to break down a little bit from what we saw with Brady Singer, some more trade candidates, and maybe more of a deep dive into this upcoming series against the Los Angeles Dodgers. But until then, you take it easy, Kansas City.